Hello, everyone. You've reached S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com. This morning, I came upon a video by Unbelievable's Justin Brierley. He was interviewing Peter J. Williams and Bart Ehrman, and they were discussing whether or not the Gospels are historically reliable. I listened to Peter and Bart on this podcast, and I came to some pretty interesting conclusions. Ehrman made four main claims. The first thing he said is there are contradictions in the Bible that simply can't be reconciled. He said that at about the 42-minute mark. But then he also said you can reconcile anything just a couple minutes later. He cites the death of Judas, as reported in Matthew 27, 1-10, where Judas hanged himself, and the death of Judas in Acts 1:18, where Judas somehow fell headlong and his bowels gushed out. He said that can't be reconciled. Peter Williams pointed out his use of the word somehow. He further pointed to the undesigned coincidence, which we're told in Acts that he fell, which is reconciled by Matthew, where he hanged himself. Judas hanged himself, and after his body started to rigor mortis, he fell perhaps over a cliff, or he hanged upside down headlong. Ehrman said that you can reconcile anything after that, which is in complete contradiction to his earlier assertion. So we're going to listen to a little snippet on that. And then after that little snippet, I'm going to give you a few more pieces of information that I gleaned from this particular video.
First, I'll say, Peter, I'll do it first in general terms, then I'll really hit it. But in general terms, Peter mentioned a scholar of oral tradition named Bartlett. So there's massive research done on oral traditions and how they work. By people who are interested in antiquity, people who are interested in the modern world, very famous names, British scholars, American scholars, Milman Parry, Albert Lord, Walter Ong, Jack Goody, Jan van Sina. All of these people have written big books on them, and they all agree that when traditions get passed along orally, even in oral cultures, where you would think they'd keep everything right, because there's no way to check it because there's no writing. So you think, well, they must memorize it, or they just pass it, they don't change it. And all of these studies show that that's wrong. They do change the stories, often quite significantly. So if the Gospels are written 40, 50 years later, at least, Peter's agreeing that Luke and Mark are not eyewitnesses. They've heard these stories. What happens to the stories? So the question is, that's what happens in every oral culture that's ever been studied. So is it true with the early Christians? And there's only one way to find out, which is to compare their stories with each other. When two authors tell us the same story, do they tell the same story or not? Or are there contradictions? Are there discrepancies? Now, Peter deals with this in his book. He has a chapter on contradictions, but I didn't quite understand it, because he listed, I forget what it was, 6 or 7 possible contradictions, and then showed they weren't contradictions, but there weren't 6 or 7 things that anybody points out to as contradictions. And so the ones that people do point out as contradictions, he didn't deal with. And so I'd like to...
Well, I know you're well known, in debates and talks for rattling off, for instance, differences and discrepancies between the resurrection accounts and those sorts of things. And you'll say, was it 2 women, or was it 1 woman, or was it, was there an angel, or wasn't there an angel, and so on. And so for you, does just simply the fact that the different accounts have different details in them about the same general story, if you like, is that, if you like, enough to say didn't happen?
No.
Is that
no.
What's going on then?
No.
What's the...
No, the question is, if somebody tells a story, is the story right or not?
Mm-hmm.
And if 2 people tell stories that are at odds with each other, not just different.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, everybody tells a story differently, but it doesn't mean they're both wrong. 4 people can tell the same story, tell it very differently, and they're just, one person's telling one part of it, another's telling another, one's emphasizing one thing, and so, of course, that kind of thing happens all the time, and that doesn't mean, but if you've got stories that have differences that cannot be reconciled with one says one thing, one says the other, not whether there's 2 women or 1 woman. If 2 women go to the tomb in one story and 1 woman goes to the tomb in another, you just say, well, okay, this person's mentioning the one, but there were 2. So there are ways to reconcile.
Sure.
There are other things that simply can't be reconciled.
Okay, give us a couple of examples and we'll see what Peter
What I would suggest.
Let's note again, he just said there are some stories that simply cannot be reconciled. Now pay close attention.
suggest that people listening to this do is not take my word for it or Peter's word for it, because what people are going to do is people on my side are going to agree with me, people on Peter's side are going to agree with him, and so I suggest just don't do that.
Okay.
Just do it for yourself. Get 2 stories in the Gospels and go through them word for word, line for line, write down everything that happens and compare your lists. And it doesn't matter, do it with the birth stories, do it with the crucifixion stories, do it with the resurrection, just do it yourself and find out, are there differences here or not? I mean, just one example. It involves Luke. The death of Judas Iscariot. So Judas in Mark, Luke, and John, Judas, nothing happens to him after, he just disappears. Okay. In Matthew's gospel, Judas hangs himself. And what happens is he goes, he feels remorse about what he's done. He's betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. He tries to return the 30 pieces. The high priest won't take it, so he throws them down in the temple and goes off and hangs himself. And the priests then say, oh, we've got these 30 pieces of silver. We can't put them back in the treasury because it's blood money. It's used to betray blood. And so they go off and they buy a field, and it's called the Field of Blood because it's purchased with blood money after Judas has hanged himself. Luke also wrote the book of Acts, as we were saying. And in chapter 1, there's a second account of Judas' death. In this account, what happens is there's nothing about Judas hanging himself, nothing about the priest buying the field. In this account, Judas goes and buys the field before he dies, and he doesn't hang himself. He somehow falls head first, and his intestines break open and bleed all over the ground. And so the people in Jerusalem start calling this the field of blood because Judas bled all over it. So those two accounts cannot be reconciled.
Okay. So before we hear Peter's response to that, is the issue then that, you know, we don't know what happened to Judas at all because these accounts, as far as you can see?
I think we can know some things.
Okay.
I think there really was a Judas. I think that he really did betray Jesus to the authorities, and I think he probably came to some kind of untimely death that was somehow connected with a field in Jerusalem.
But as to reconciling these two stories, they're just different.
But if you want to read Matthew and say, yes, that's what really happened, or if you want to read Acts, that's what really happened.
It's helpful to drill down on a specific example sometimes. Sure. So how do you read these two accounts of Judas's
Sure.
death?
I'd like to come to that first, but I hope also to come back on the whole question of oral tradition.
Okay, we will, yes.
So I think it's really interesting that we got these two accounts, and Bart mentioned two things as he went through the account in Acts. One is he used the word somehow, that Judas somehow, and the phrase is, became headlong. Well, that to me is just crying out for some more details. We need to explain. We need some sort of like vertical elevation. Oh, Matthew has vertical elevation because he has to hang himself. So I'd want to say that the account in Acts is crying out for a bit more. And the other issue we got is his intestines. How on earth do his intestines start bursting forth? I mean, like, that wouldn't normally happen if you just
simply fell over in a field.
In other words, I'd want to say, that makes a lot of sense. Now, as for...
So how did it happen?
So how did it happen? I'd want to say, I think you can put the two together. Probably the data are underdetermined, as in that is, I can't... there would be multiple scenarios that would fit those.
Give me one.
Let's say someone hangs, and then the rope snaps, and after they're dead, and their entrails burst out.
Okay.
I'm not a medic on that, but
Yes. Okay. So let me ask this: if somebody's hanging and the rope snaps, that's happened before. How do they fall?
Bart is going to make an assumption here that the only way to fall after being hung is to fall onto your feet, because he's assuming, of course, that he's hung by the neck. But when people are hung, you could be hung by your arms, you could be hung by your ankles, you could be hung by your neck, you could be upside down, you could be hung in a number of different ways in a number of different places. But Bart is making a very wooden assumption. So let's see what he says.
Down.
Do they fall head first?
Well, it depends what their feet
hit. Does it depend?
Yes, it does. It depends what they're hanging over.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, if you're hanging over something and there's a rock forward and you're going to trip on it and you go head forward, I mean, like, these things can happen. I don't know.
It sounds like we're doing CSI here, crime scene investigation.
I just think the data's underdetermined.
Let me just say this. Yeah, it's underdetermined. So to reconcile it, you have to come up with a completely implausible scenario to reconcile it.
Let's be realistic. Were any of those scenarios completely implausible? If you knew the hilly terrain where Judas actually hung himself, this is not an implausible solution.
You can reconcile anything. Let me give you an example how you can reconcile anything. Right?
Okay, you can reconcile anything. Now, he had just started this conversation saying that these two gospel passages, the gospel passage and the Acts, the book of Acts, these were irreconcilable, but now he just said you can reconcile anything. Bart, come on. Let's go to the second thing that Bart pointed out in this video. Now, I'm not going to play any more of the video, but I will point out a few other things that he claimed. He claimed the synoptic gospels contain more accurate information about Jesus by virtue of their chronological age relative to the Gospel of John. Ehrman used this assertion to say that the information in the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke is more accurate about Jesus' specific words than the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, the I am statements are more explicit claims of Jesus' divinity than what is seen in the synoptics. Peter Williams pointed out the way the examples in the synoptics, in parables, in Jesus' curing of a blind man, and in Jesus walking on water and stating, I am, align with John's Gospels. They're examples. He further pointed to the way the Gospels gradually reveal the truth of Jesus' divinity. To add to this point, the book of Daniel 9, we are given the timing of Jesus' crucifixion and when his divinity would have been revealed, which is also, you can compare this with Zechariah 9:9. When he traveled into Jerusalem on a donkey and was celebrated and honored as Hosanna in the highest. Hayner has predicted that this occurred on Monday, just prior to the crucifixion. The third thing that Bart says in this video is in the earliest Gospel of Mark, he says the Gospel of Mark is the earliest, and Peter said he wasn't sure about that. He hadn't already made a claim on that. He's not sure, possibly it could be Matthew too. But Peter, he said in Gospel of Mark, the author never gave an instance when Jesus indicated that he is God. He said that Jesus never said in his own words that he is God. However, that's patently false if you simply read the text. Peter Williams agreed that Jesus didn't call himself God in the Gospels, but note that he called himself something even more powerful, the Son of Man. Given the Jewish context of the time and the references to the Son of Man in the book of Daniel, this is very powerful. Toward the end of Jesus' ministry, he portended his death several times. He said in Mark 10:33-34, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise. Note that Jesus referred to himself in the third person as the events he portended were obviously about him. Here's another passage in Mark. Then the high priest stood before them and asked Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent, gave no answer. Compare this to Isaiah 53. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? I am, said Jesus, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. The high priest tore his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses? He asked. You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, prophecy! And the guards took him and beat him, just as he had foretold. The significance of this event was twofold. For one, the Sanhedrin knew that Jesus was directly referring to the prophecy from Daniel about the Messiah in 7:13. Secondly, his crucifixion was based on a charge of blasphemy. They had no other allegations against him. Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man 14 times in the Gospel of Mark and 81 times in all four Gospels. Sometimes he spoke in the third person, and sometimes he spoke in the first person. One simply needs to read the full text to understand the meaning. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. And he said to them, truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come with power. Now, note that in that passage, which is also in Mark, Jesus took Peter, James, and John up on a high mountain just after where they witnessed his transfiguration. In Mark 9:9, it says, as they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. Referring to himself as I am and as a Son of Man had significant implications to the Jews of this time. Quote from Tribblehorn, Jesus' use of the more potent Son of Man was subtle, yet at the same time actually quite direct. As we have discovered, this phrase alone supremely reinforced the claim of deity, as does 1 Enoch. Son of Man alone would have been sufficient for the Sanhedrin to declare blasphemy. Yet Jesus continued. He looked Caiaphas and the council right in the eye and said, in essence, I am God. Like a good rabbi, Jesus included all elements of the defined messianic package in his short answer. He neatly combined the more potent Son of Man phrase that virtually says it all with several supercharged rabbinic phrases. By linking Daniel 7 into his reply, he includes the Son of Clouds, the Shekinah glory, the Word who created all things, the right hand of the Ancient of Days, at eternal dominion, glory and kingship, and all the kingdoms and nations of the world will worship him. Jesus could not have been rabbinically clearer. That's again, end quote from Tribblehorn. According to Tribblehorn, Jesus is referred to as God in writings by Ignatius in 105, Clement in 150, Justin Martyr in 160, Irenaeus in 180, Tertullian in 200, Origen in 225, Novatian in 235, Cyprian in 250, Methodius in 290, Lactantius in 304, Arnobius in 305, and those references were all before the Council of Nicaea, when Dan Brown, in his fictional book, The Da Vinci Code, tried to claim that Jesus' divinity was announced for the very first time. The fourth point that Bart makes in this video is the tangential material in Luke's account, in Luke and Acts, on locations and context may be correct, yet the primary story suffered from a game of telephone due to the recounting of oral history. He says the facts that they got the facts of the locations correct and the names correct is one thing. However, the stories, according to Bart Ehrman, are incorrect. Of course, Peter made a very good case against this by pointing out that if the names were correct, it should imply that the story is correct. However, Bart did not listen to that. If we take Bart Ehrman to task on his claim that the authors only recorded the tangential information accurately while suggesting inaccuracies in the main points in the Gospels and Acts, one would need to see what Ehrman himself has said in the past on these points in his book, Misquoting Jesus. A reader asked him in his second edition of Misquoting Jesus, 2005, in the second edition, of course, now this is not in the third edition. Strangely enough, this particular passage was omitted. But here's what it said. The reader said, Bruce Metzger, your mentor in textual criticism, to whom this book is dedicated, has said that there is nothing in this variance of Scripture that challenges any essential Christian beliefs. Example, the bodily resurrection of Jesus or the Trinity. Why do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy based on the scribal errors you discovered in the biblical manuscripts? Here's what Bart said. Bruce Metzger is one of the great scholars of modern times, and I dedicated the book to him because he was both my inspiration for going into textual criticism and the person who trained me in the field. And even though we may disagree on important religious questions, he is a firmly committed Christian, and I am not. We are in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. If he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. He goes on to say, the position I argue for in Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. In other words, he is saying that the core tenets of Christianity, as described in the Bible, are true. The main points of the story are true. So what he said in this video about the main points in the story being erroneous and the outcome of a telephone game is obviously erroneous in itself. Bart again has contradicted himself. So in conclusion, Bart Ehrman has admitted that the passages in the New Testament that cannot be reconciled can be reconciled, because you can reconcile anything, he also said. The synoptic gospels that Ehrman claims have no indications that Jesus said he is God quite clearly offer dozens of examples through Jesus' ministry and through his words that he is the Son of Man, again, 81 times. For this reason, he was considered blasphemous and crucified by the Jewish Sanhedrin. Finally, using his logic, Ehrman earlier and thus more accurate claim that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by his suggestions of a telephone game must be given primacy over his later evolved beliefs of today, which we witnessed on the Unbelievable channel with Justin Brierley. I want to say what a fantastic job Justin Brierley does. I love watching his stuff. I highly recommend everyone go over there and watch the rest of this video. I will link it in the descriptions. In the meanwhile, what I really hope you'll do is take a couple of seconds and like and subscribe this video. Please tell your friends about it, and please come again. You can reach me on SJ Thomason. You can find me on Twitter at LEAD1225. You can also find me on my website at Christian-apologist.com. Thank you. Come again. Bye-bye.